Widowed settler. Abandoned with newborn twins until Comanche hunter found them. In the blizzard of all the storms life can bring, have you ever asked yourself, what remains after everything you once believed in has been swept away by wind and snow? A young mother, two newborn babies, and a strange land where no one speaks her language. Can love, quiet and small as it may be enough to keep them alive in a place that seems to offer no room for life? Before we begin this emotional journey, would you mind letting us know what city you are listening from today? Maybe you're somewhere sunny or in the rush of a bustling city. But today's story, no matter where you are, just might reach something very deep inside you. Let's begin. Prepare for a journey that's not just about survival, but about how a woman, with no power, no weapons, touched the heart of an entire community with nothing but bare hands and unconditional love for her children. This isn't a story about miracles. This is a story about one woman and how she turned what seemed to be her final days into a new spring. Montana, winter of 1875. The wind sliced through the mountain range like razors, carrying the wailing howl of emptiness and unannounced blizzards. Clara Bennett, a 27-year-old widow with tangled light brown hair and eyes as blue as the summer sky she hadn't seen since her husband died, curled up in the corner of a sagging wooden cabin, the last shelter she had once shared with the man who had promised to carry her through every storm. Two newborn babies, not even 2 days old, slept in the exhausted arms of their mother. Clara knew full well that if no miracle came soon, all three of them wouldn't survive the night. The fireplace had gone cold since early morning. The last of the firewood was gone. She had burned the table legs, then pieces of the bed frame, just to keep the flames alive. At first, there had been hope. Now, even the ashes weren't enough to warm her trembling hands. On the floor, an old crumpled journal lay open, its yellowed pages quivering under the wind slipping through the doorframe. It was Elijah's journal, her husband's, the man who had gone out days ago to find help from a town 2 days away on horseback and never returned. Clara remembered every word he wrote, each message tender yet firm. If I don't come back, you must live, for the children, for both of us. She had read that line dozens of times, and each time it made her sob. But today there were no tears left. The wind howled again, like the voices of wandering souls from the winter before. Clara pulled the last thick blanket tighter around her and the babies. Her daughters stirred, a hand the size of a moth's wing poking out from the swaddle. Clara gave a faint smile, a twisted curve of her lips in the face of despair. "I'm sorry, Lily," she whispered. "I tried." And then, a faint creak from the door. Clara froze, her heart stopping for a beat. It couldn't be the wind. That sound was unlike anything she'd heard before. She clutched the children tighter to her chest and groped for the rusted knife in the corner of the room, her hands shaking so badly she nearly dropped it. The door swung open. In the pale light of the dying day, a figure emerged from the curtain of snow, tall, wrapped in a damp fur cloak, with eyes dark and deep as a canyon. The man stood still for a moment, his gaze sweeping across Clara, the babies, and the nearly collapsed room. He said nothing, just bent down, placed a bundle of sheepskin at the door, and slowly stepped inside. Clara backed away, knife pointed toward the stranger, her voice hoarse from cold and fear. Don't come closer." The man remained silent. He raised a hand and slowly pulled back his hood, revealing long, sleek black hair and features unmistakably native. In his hands was a small bundle of dry wood, neatly tied. No weapon, no threat. Just a calm gaze, and something Clara hadn't expected. An expression of sorrow, as if he had seen her before in another life. The space between them hung frozen for a few long seconds. Then Clara dropped the knife. Not out of trust, but out of exhaustion. And a small part of her believed, if he meant harm, he wouldn't have brought dry wood. The man knelt by the hearth. With swift, practiced movements, he lit the fire again, the flames flickering to life in the darkness, the first light Clara had seen since Elijah left. She stared at the fire like a stranger seeing herself in a mirror, trembling, disbelieving, but hoping it was real. The man pulled a strip of dried meat from his leather pouch, set it on a flat piece of cast iron, and slid it toward her. He spoke, his voice deep but gentle, in broken English. "Eat, for all three." Clara stared at him, stunned. Then, as instinct took over, she pulled the meat toward her, took a small bite, broke off a piece, and fed it to the baby girl. He asked no questions. She asked for none in return, because between those who have seen death up close, survival becomes the only language left. Clara didn't know his name, didn't know why. In the heart of a ruthless snowstorm, a native man had appeared with fire and food for 3 fading lives. But she knew one thing. If there was still hope tonight, then the man before her was the reason why. As the fire slowly pushed back the cold that had burrowed into her skin, Clara still couldn't take her eyes off the man sitting across from her. He didn't speak much, only quietly split more wood, kept the flames steady, and occasionally glanced over at the sleeping infants. In the flickering light, his face became clearer. High cheekbones, a straight nose, eyes deep like a winter river, but not cold. It was the face of someone who had lived through more than he ever said. Clara didn't know where to begin. Everything she had ever been taught about Indians had come from cautionary tales in school, warnings soaked in fear. But this man, tending the fire, handing her warm water, was nothing like that. There was something about him that made it impossible for Clara to look away. Not out of curiosity, but because for the first time in months, she felt someone was seeing her, not with pity, but with presence. "My name is Clara," she said softly, as if speaking too loudly would shatter the fragile peace wrapped around them. The man looked up, studied her for a moment, then answered slowly, "Talon." He paused, then added, as though not used to saying his name aloud, "Talon Greywind." The name echoed in the air like a story untold. Clara nodded gently. She poured more water into the pot, then hesitantly asked, "Where did you come from? How did you know I was here?" Talon was quiet for a moment. The fire reflected in his eyes like a memory. "I hunt near here, saw smoke, then no more." He paused, voice lower. "I lost someone once because I didn't get there in time." Just one sentence, but Clara understood. That kind of pain didn't need many words. It lived in his voice, in the way his hand clenched slightly as he spoke. Someone who had witnessed loss always recognized it in others, and maybe that's why he was here. The wind howled outside the door, a reminder that the world beyond remained as cruel as ever. Clara looked at her children, then at Talon. She had no plan beyond today, no more food, no horse, no one is waiting. And if not for Talon, she didn't want to imagine that ending. "Are you leaving?" she asked, trying to sound steady, though her fingers gripped the torn hem of her dress. Talon looked at her directly. "Tomorrow morning, but not without you." He said it like a decision he had made long ago. "My camp, far, but there are people, food, safer than here." Clara swallowed. She hadn't left the forest since arriving with Elijah. The thought of walking away from her husband's grave, of carrying 2 newborns into unknown lands with a stranger, it would have been unthinkable just a week ago. But now, in this moment, it was her only choice between life and death. And Talon wasn't a stranger anymore. He was fire. He was water. He was the final thread of hope. I'll go," she said, her voice trembling. Talon nodded, unsurprised. He added more wood to the stove, then pulled a small bundle from his leather pouch and unwrapped a few dried herbs. He placed them into the boiling water. A calming scent drifted through the room. "For the children," he explained, "helps sleep. No cough." Clara looked at him, heart heavy with thoughts. It wasn't just gratitude she felt. She sensed she was crossing some unseen threshold. Part of her was afraid, the rest knew. There was no other path. That night, as Talon leaned against the wall with one hand resting near his bow, Clara closed her eyes for the first time in 3 days. The sleep wasn't deep, but enough for her to dream. In the dream, Elijah stood in the snow, nodding and smiling before slowly disappearing. She awoke before sunrise. Talon hadn't moved, his eyes still open, quietly guarding the lives he couldn't bear to lose again. Dawn came after the longest night of Clara's life. The sky was gray like a soaked blanket, offering no sun but also no falling snow. Outside the cabin, the woods stood still as if waiting for something. Clara wrapped her children tightly in the sheepskin Talon had left, then lifted them into her arms. Her legs buckled under days without food, but her heart beat harder than ever. She didn't know where she was going, only that she couldn't stay. Talon was waiting by the door with a makeshift hand sled tied together with coarse rope and strips of dry bark, just big enough for the children and a few small sacks. He had padded it carefully with fur and dry straw from the supply shed. No horse, no wheels, just 2 people, 3 lives, and a long, narrow path through the snowbound woods. "Go before the sun climbs," Talon said shortly, his voice low like a distant drum. Clara nodded, stepped down from the cabin porch, and looked back one last time, at the place where she once dreamed simply with Elijah, where she gave birth, where she nearly died. She didn't know it then, but it would be the last time she'd ever see it. They started walking. At first, only through the thin snow near the cabin, but soon the snow thickened to her calves. Every step was a battle with her body, with the wind that slashed at her skin like knives. Clara walked behind Talon, the man striding forward as if he knew every tree and bend by heart. When she faltered, he would stop, extend his hand, say nothing, just help her back up and continue on. No complaints, no weariness, as if he had been born from this land, and she was just a drifting breeze. The babies slept peacefully in the sled, cheeks rosy in the warm wraps. Clara looked at them and gave silent thanks. Perhaps for the first time since giving birth, she no longer felt guilty for not giving them a better beginning. When the sun reached its peak, Talon stopped near a large fallen tree, pointing to a small clearing. "Stop here, eat." He pulled dried meat, a handful of preserved berries, and something that nearly made Clara cry, a fistful of hard corn cakes. No one had given her bread since Elijah died. She ate slowly, not out of hunger, but because her throat was tight. "Is it far?" she asked, glancing at the mist-covered trail ahead. Talon looked at the sky. 3 days, no storm. 5 if a storm comes. Clara let out a soft laugh. Her first in months, dry, but real. "Sounds like hope to me." Talon didn't smile, but his eyes softened. They continued. Northern forests darkened fast. Shadows from tall trees stretched like old fingers clutching the wet earth. Talon found a hollow shielded from the wind, where he built a shelter from branches and fur. He lit a fire, then checked the area by scattering ash around the camp to spot signs of predators. Clara held the babies inside, pulled out Elijah's journal, and read a few lines, as she always did. "If one day you must walk alone, let each step be a prayer." She pressed a hand to her chest, where her heart still beat, slow but sure. Talon didn't sleep right away. He sat outside, watching a sky filled with stars Clara had forgotten still existed. She stayed inside, watching his silhouette against the fur wall. A man with no bond, no reason to save her, keeping watch as if her life was his to protect. And under that silent sky, for the first time, Clara didn't feel alone. She didn't know what the Comanche camp would be like, didn't know if she'd be accepted, if she could survive among people of a culture she'd been taught to fear. But she knew this. If Talon said there was food, if he said it was safe, she believed him. In a world where life could be buried by a single snowstorm, trust was all anyone could carry. And now she carried that trust, heading toward a place she'd never known, with the only man left who still knew the way. The fire on their second night no longer flickered in desperation. It burned steady, warm, glowing with red embers like a heart still beating in a world frozen long ago. Clara sat a little closer to Talon, not from the cold, but because the space between them, though only inches, was beginning to fill with something unspoken. The babies slept soundly, faces pink with the help of herbs Talon had brewed from leaves she'd never known. Overhead, stars scattered like diamonds caught in velvet. Clara looked up and breathed softly. In the city, people don't see stars. Smoke and lights steal the sky. Talon didn't respond right away. He followed her gaze, then said slowly, like walking through memory, "Stars don't change. Only people stop looking." His words made Clara fall quiet. Some things, she realized, don't need further explanation. The campfire crackled. Talon pulled a small leather-wrapped object from his pouch. He opened it. Inside, a bracelet woven from plant fiber and bird bone. Rough, simple, but clearly cherished. "My sister's," he said. Her name was Sanny. Clara tilted her head, waiting for more. Talon clutched the small item. "She died in a storm, just like this, cold, silent. I was out hunting, didn't come back in time. When I returned," his voice faltered. Clara didn't ask more. But she placed her hand gently over his, not to comfort, but to share. She knew that feeling, coming back too late, after everything you loved had disappeared in silence. "I lost Elijah last spring," she said as if confessing. "He fell from his horse trying to reach the outpost. No one helped. I buried him behind the cabin, under the tree he planted." The wind whispered through the branches. Talon looked up, firelight dancing in his eyes like a smoldering memory. "He wrote something for me. In the old journal, things I never wanted to forget." Clara opened her satchel, pulled out the worn book, and flipped to a page wrinkled by tears. She read slowly, not because she couldn't see, but because each word cut deep. "If one day you don't see me return, believe that I'm still somewhere. In the wind, in the fire, in the sky. You are not alone, because my love doesn't knight a body to remain." She paused. Her voice cracked at the end. Talon said nothing, but he looked at her longer than usual, a gaze not of pity, but of respect for someone who had known pain and still stood up. After a while, he said, "Some leave behind flames, not ashes." Clara smiled, her eyes glinting with heat and memory. "And some promise nothing, but show up anyway." That night, they didn't sleep early, not from fear, but because for the first time they had reason to stay awake, to hear each other breathe, to share the cracks in their souls. Every story was a small stone placed on the fragile bridge connecting two worlds, a cast-out white woman and a misunderstood native man. Clara told him about her wedding, the first soup she made that Elijah nearly choked on from too much salt. Talon spoke of his first hunt with his father, and the one time his mother struck him for breaking his bow. They laughed, softly, lightly, as if laughing too loud might break something delicate between them. When Clara began nodding off from exhaustion, Talon quietly added wood to the fire. He took Sandy's bracelet and gently tied it to the baby girl's wrist, whispering something in Comanche, a prayer only his people would understand. But Clara felt it was a promise. Neither of them gave a name to what was forming. Neither spoke of the future. But as night passed and the fire still burned, they both knew. They had survived one more day, not just with food or warmth, but with each other's presence. As dawn peeled back the frozen veil of the third morning, Clara opened her eyes into the air so cold it stung her skin. Snow hadn't fallen overnight, but the chill burrowed deep into her bones, a silent warning that nature still held trials ahead. She reached out and touched her daughter's hand, warm. Then she glanced outside and saw that Talon was already gone. He always left early, scouting the path, checking for animal tracks, and determining direction. When he returned, there was a tension in his eyes Clara had never seen before. "Almost there," he said shortly, voice hoarse from cold or worry. "Camp by this afternoon." Clara tightened the wrap around her child, heart pounding. She should have felt relief. Food, shelter, and safety lay ahead, but instead, a dull fear crept in, a fear no words could explain. She was about to walk into a world she had only ever known through the lens of warning and prejudice, and she wouldn't enter it alone. She carried two fragile lives with her, as delicate as the first snow. By midday, they crossed a narrow pass. As they stepped through the thinning forest, Clara saw them for the first time. Thin trails of smoke rising from scattered lodges beyond the pine trees. No fences, no signs. Only the scent of damp wood smoke, smoked meat, and the distant sound of horses from the camp. "Don't look them in the eyes right away," Talon warned, his gaze fixed ahead. "Some aren't used to strangers, especially white ones." Clara nodded and held her children closer. They walked a little farther until shapes began to appear. Men standing guard, women drying meat, children darting across and pausing to stare. No one greeted them, no one smiled, but no one turned them away either. Only stares, heavy with curiosity and indifference, as if unsure whether to welcome or reject what they saw. An older woman emerged from the largest lodge. Her hair was silver as winter reeds, tied in a tight knot behind her head, her black eyes commanding. She didn't hurry, but every step seemed to part the wind. Clara didn't need to ask. This was Talon's mother. Her name was Ayanna. Ayanna looked Clara over from head to toe, then glanced at the two infants cradled in her arms. She said nothing. Turning to her son, she spoke in Comanche. Talon responded. His voice was low and steady, but Clara noticed the flicker of unease in his eyes. Ayanna stepped closer and studied Clara again, this time deeper, as if she wanted to see through her skin and into her marrow. Then she turned without a word, said something else, and disappeared into the lodge. Talon looked at Clara. "She doesn't want outsiders," he said, voice quiet but firm. "But I gave my word. You and the children can stay tonight. Tomorrow, there's a council." Clara nodded. One night. She could make it through one more night. They were taken to a small lodge at the edge of the camp. It had nothing but straw mats, a few animal hides, and a water jar. But to Clara, it felt like heaven. As night fell, Talon left some food and stepped outside. Before leaving, he turned back and spoke in a voice she had never heard from him before. Low, nearly a whisper. "Don't be afraid, they're not your enemies. They just don't know yet that you're not theirs." Then he was gone. Clara sat beside her sleeping children, heart in turmoil. She couldn't blame them. How could she blame people pushed to the margins by those who looked like her? All she hoped for was a chance, even the smallest one. That night, she wrote on the final page of her journal, "I've set foot in a place Elijah would never believe I could reach. But if he were here, he'd understand why I had to keep walking." Outside, the wind whispered through the lodges like an ancient language. And in the darkness, Clara felt something stir, not acceptance, but a test. And she was ready to face it. The next morning came with no greetings, no food offerings, only the rustle of tent cloth and silent eyes peeking through seams. Clara carried her children out just as the sun cleared the treetops. The wind wasn't as sharp as before, but the cold still crept to her scalp, reminding her she stood on land that was not hers. Talon arrived early. He no longer wore his fur cloak, but a hand-embroidered tunic stitched with red thread, more formal in style. Clara followed, arms tightly clutching the bundled children. They passed large lodges, women preparing ritual food, children practicing archery with elders, and all eyes drawn to her like silent arrows. In the camp center was a large ring of pressed grass and white stones. In the middle sat an unlit fire pit, surrounded by elders seated according to age and status. Ayanna sat in the center, eyes closed, hands resting on her knees, as if listening to the breath of the earth. Clara remained outside the circle. Talon addressed the council briefly, then stepped back, allowing her forward. No signals, no translator, no invitation. But the waiting eyes, cold yet not distant, were the silent question. "Who are you, and why are you here?" Clara inhaled deeply. She lifted her children high so all could see. Then, from her coat, she pulled a worn leather sketchbook. Not Elijah's journal, but a book of drawings. She opened it, turning each page, the cabin in the storm, a hand holding 2 newborns, Talon at the hearth, snow-covered woods, a figure on horseback fading into a blizzard, shrinking, then vanishing. No words, just images. But they told everything Clara had endured. One elder nodded. Another placed his hands together. Ayanna's expression didn't change, but her eyes lingered on the page showing Elijah, the man Clara had loved and lost. Clara stepped forward again. She laid the sketchbook in the center of the circle, then knelt, placing her children beside it, and bowed her head in silence. It was not a plea, it was a vow. Talon held his breath. Every eye was on that moment. A white woman kneeling among those once labeled enemies, carrying no gun, no legal authority, only her children and her truth. 1 minute, then 2, and then Ayanna rose. She walked slowly to Clara and stared into her eyes. Then, unexpectedly, she knelt. She placed one hand on the baby boy's head, then looked to the girl, where Sanny's bracelet still shimmered in the light. Ayanna raised her head to Clara. She spoke something in Comanche, then drew a small symbol on Clara's forehead, as if marking her or offering a blessing. Talon shivered. He knew what it meant. Not everyone had seen his mother do that. This woman, this white widow, no blood ties, no marriage, no endorsement, had just been acknowledged. Not as a guest, but as one allowed to remain. Ayanna stood, scanning the council. No one objected. No one left. The meeting ended with no announcements. But Clara understood. She had passed the first circle. Back in the small lodge, Clara laid her children down and looked out through the flap of tanned hide. For the first time since arriving, the wind didn't feel like needles, and something strange happened in her mind. She stopped counting the days until she could leave. She began thinking of what she needed to do to stay. 3 days after the quiet fire circle, Clara was allowed out of the lodge more often, First, to draw water from the communal well. Then, to receive meals. People still didn't speak much to her, but they no longer turned away when she passed. Some children watched her with curiosity, then ducked behind skirts when she looked back. But it was a beginning. Clara felt grateful even for their quiet indifference. After days of wind chill and contempt chasing every breath, indifference almost felt like peace. One morning, sunlight filtered through the tent wall, warming the cheeks of her children. Clara sat and stitched their names onto an old cloth. She'd thought about this since the day they were born in that frozen cabin, when all she knew was that she was still alive and needed to mark that life. "I'll name her Lily Grace," Clara whispered as if speaking to someone lost. "For the first flower I saw bloom in Montana, and for the virtue I hope she never loses." She paused and looked at the baby boy still sleeping, lips pursed as if dreaming of warm milk. "And the boy," she said, "will be Elias River, in memory of his father, and to remind him that some rivers never flow backward." Before she could begin stitching, Talon entered. He had heard her. Sitting across from her, he asked, gently, "Would you want them to have names here too?" Clara looked up. His eyes weren't pushy, not interfering. Just an offer. An extended hand for someone to choose to step forward. She didn't answer right away, but then slowly she nodded. If they belong to both worlds, they need both names. The naming ceremony was quiet. No drums, no songs, just a peaceful morning outside the largest lodge, where Ayana sat drawing symbols on the children's foreheads with ash. She named Lily Nokose, the first young wind. Elias became Taku, the remaining flame. Clara stood still as each name was spoken aloud. She didn't understand the language fully, but she understood the meaning. These names didn't replace hers. They stood beside them, like 2 feet on the same path. When the ritual ended, Ayana looked at Clara and nodded, not a greeting, no thanks, but acknowledgement. She was no longer a passing stranger. That night, Clara took needle and thread and began stitching the names. Lily Grace, Nokose, Elias River, Taku. On the small cloth, those names lay side by side, neither competing, neither denied. They lay there like 2 small suns, one rising from her east, one from Talon's west, warming a future still uncertain but full of hope. As she pulled the final thread through, Talon stepped into the doorway. "I've never met anyone like you," he said. It was the longest sentence he had spoken to her since they'd arrived. Clara smiled and looked up. "And I never thought I'd hear that from someone like you." No further explanation was needed, but as the fire outside cast its shadows onto the lodge wall, blurring into one form, both knew something had changed. Not through words, not through ritual, but through names and the courage to let them coexist. Since the naming ceremony, Clara began to feel that she had a place in the camp, not exactly welcomed but no longer cast aside. Children had started to smile at her as they passed by. A few women offered her warm, fragrant corn cakes, and Ayana occasionally paused outside her lodge as if checking in on the 2 children. But amidst this gentle shift, there remained one gaze that always lingered on Clara, not with kindness or curiosity, but with silence as sharp as a blade not yet drawn. That was Zena. The woman never announced herself, but her presence was unmistakable, like the bite of winter air against bare skin. Her hair was ink black, her eyes deep as stone, and her footsteps sure enough to command attention without asking for it. Clara had heard of her from Ayana. Zena was the best weaver in the tribe, and, at least before Clara's arrival, She had been seen as Talon's future. One morning, as Clara washed clothes by the stream, Zena arrived. She said nothing. She simply sat across from Clara, pulled an unfinished embroidered cloth from her satchel, and began stitching. No introduction, no questions, just a quiet presence full of meaning. Clara smiled politely. "Your clothes are beautiful." Zena didn't look up. She replied softly, "I'm sewing it for the woman who will marry Talon." Clara's heart skipped half a beat. She didn't know how to respond. The words weren't a warning, nor an invitation to step back. It was a door left slightly ajar, and only someone from the inside had the right to close it. "I didn't come to take anyone," Clara said, not shying away from Zena's eyes, now raised to meet hers. "I'm just trying to survive and raise my children." Zena paused mid-stitch. Her gaze softened for just a moment. Then she stood, brushed off her skirt, and said, "Survival is also a way of taking space." Then she walked away. Clara didn't feel angry, not even hurt. But something inside her stung, a fresh scratch, not left by Zena, but by the realization that even if the elders accepted her, even if the children smiled, even if the sacred fire had witnessed her vows, the human heart doesn't yield to ritual so easily. That day, Clara didn't tell Talon. But at dinner, when she sat a little closer to him than usual, Talon asked out of nowhere, "You met Zena?" Clara nodded. "She weaves beautifully." "She's strong," Talon replied. "She's a warrior in her own way." He didn't elaborate, but the way he looked at Clara had changed, like he was beginning to see another kind of warrior in her, quieter, unarmored, bowless, but fighting every day just the same. Clara didn't defend herself. She didn't deny Zena's place. She simply sat, fed Elias, and rocked Lily to sleep. Once both children were resting, she said softly, "There's no fault in loving, only in hurting each other because of it." Talon didn't reply, but that night when Clara left the fire early, he was the one who added wood to the flames behind her. No words, no long glance, but Clara understood. Sometimes, to hold your ground in a place you once didn't belong, you don't need to win. You just need not to retreat. That night, the cold was strange. There was no wind, yet the chill clung to everything, settled into my skin, wrapped around my breath. Clara woke to soft whimpers from Lily. She sat up abruptly, heart lurching. The child burned like coal, face flushed, lips cracked, her breathing shallow, like wind stuck inside a chimney. Elias slept soundly beside her, but Lily did not. Her tiny hand was limp, soaked in sweat, eyes half open but unfocused. Clara clutched her to her chest, the cabin's early days rushing back, helplessness, solitude, dread. But this time, there was no Elijah, no white doctor. There was only one choice, and that choice had a name: Talon. She wrapped Lily tightly and ran into the darkness, barefoot on the frozen earth, arms cradling a tiny life burning bright and wild. Ayana's lodge glowed faintly. Clara didn't need to knock. She whimpered once, and Ayana emerged. She didn't ask much, just placed a hand on Lily's forehead, then called for water, a handful of dried herbs and a small jar of dark powder. The scent of crushed plants hit Clara's nose. Strong, bitter, but not repellent. Talon appeared minutes later. He said nothing as he saw Clara trembling, her hair wild, her eyes wide with panic. He simply sat beside her, rested a hand on her shoulder, and held her upright. Ayana began the medicine, grinding, mixing, heating, and then spooning the liquid into Lily's mouth with a small bone spoon. The child screamed and thrashed, but in the end, swallowed. Clara cried too, not at Lily's screams but from the terror of not knowing how to help. "I should have gone back to town," she burst out, voice cracking. where there's a doctor, where there's medicine, everything I don't have here." Ayanna didn't look up. She kept wrapping Lily in layers of paste and cloth, like sealing a fragile life back together. "There, you have medicine," she said slowly, "but also distance. Here, we have no medicine, but we have heart." Clara didn't fully understand, but Talon took her hand and repeated, this time in his voice, "We won't let your child be alone." That sentence was the last thread holding Clara together. She stayed there, clutching her feverish daughter, while Ayanna moved calmly, step by step. Talon kept her grounded as her breath shortened with panic. Dawn crept in. The sun didn't rise fully, but light began to filter through the trees. Lily lay more still. Her breath slowed. Sweat still beaded on her brow, but her hand gripped tighter. Clara whispered her daughter's name over and over, like a prayer with no religion. And when the child's eyes fluttered open again, pupils dark as springbird's wings, Clara broke into sobs. Not because she stopped being afraid, but because she was still allowed to be. That, too, was a luxury for a mother who once believed she could lose everything in one snowy night. "You kept her alive," Talon whispered. Clara didn't answer. But when Elias woke and crawled over to rest his head against his sister's chest by instinct, she knew she was in the right place. Not because it had medicine, not because Talon always arrived just in time, but because, for the first time, pain did not mean solitude. Inside that small lodge, as firelight brightened and the scent of herbs lingered in the air, Clara understood something. Survival is essential, but to have someone fight beside you for that survival, that's the miracle. Winter hadn't ended, but after Lily's fever broke, Clara began seeing everything with new eyes. Not fear, not quiet gratitude, but the desire to join in, truly belong, to the rhythm of this place. She didn't want to merely be accepted, she wanted to contribute. From that day forward, Clara no longer waited in her lodge for food. She woke early, tied her hair, nursed the children, wrapped Elias in front, Lily behind, and stepped outside. She asked to learn how to stack firewood, then how to identify herbs for tea, how to hang meat on pine-lined strings to prevent rot. Her first teacher wasn't Ayanna. It was a 12-year-old girl named Neha, the daughter of a hunter named Kuto. Neha's hands were quick as squirrels, eyes bright as new moons. She didn't speak much but taught with gestures, hand, grip, twist, break. Clara mimicked each move, sometimes clumsy, sometimes dropping things, but always laughing afterward. Gradually, others began letting her come closer. One afternoon, Zena, the woman who once sat coldly across from her at the stream, unexpectedly invited Clara to the dying grounds. "If you don't know how to keep the color, just watch my hands," Zena said, not sharply, not challengingly, but openly. Clara learned to boil bark in salt water to create deep purples, and to crush indigo leaves for pale blue hues like morning fog. Her hands, once only used for holding babies or washing dishes, now bore the stains of the earth, smelling faintly of the forest. Talon never interfered with her learning, but he was always near, sometimes leaving a skinned rabbit by her door, sometimes passing by just to say, "You cut the wind wrong." Not scolding, just guiding. And the next time, Clara cut it right. Ayanna said little, but now and then she passed by, watched Clara pounding herbs or tying bird traps, and gave a small nod, just enough to let Clara know she was on the right path. One day, Neha led Clara into the woods, where a low-growing plant crept along the ground. "This heals cracked feet," Neha said, pointing to a cluster of green leaves. Clara bent down to pick it up, then asked softly, "What's it called?" Neha frowned. "It doesn't need a name, just someone to know it's useful. The words silenced Clara. Wasn't she the same? A woman no one expected, no one named, no one called necessary, slowly becoming of use. One early spring morning, while dew still clung to the leaves, Ayanna handed Clara a small deerskin pouch. Inside were dried seeds. "Sow them into soft ground," she said. "When it's warm, they'll grow." Clara was stunned, not by the seeds, but by the trust. This was the first time she'd been given something to begin a season. "We plant not because we're hungry," Ayanna added, "but to remind ourselves to believe in tomorrow." Clara clutched the pouch. These hands, once trembling in a blizzard, holding two fragile infants, now held the beginnings of a season without snow. Something shifted inside her. Not just a feeling, but a vision. Elias and Lily, barefoot, running between green rows, laughter rising like spring streams, and herself, standing beneath the sun, no longer asking, "When do I have to leave?" but only, "How long will it take to plant?" In a place once defined by survival, Clara had begun learning to live. Not as a guest, but as one who cultivates. That morning, the sky held no clouds. The air was so clear that Clara could hear the snap of a twig hitting the ground 10 paces away. She was pounding leaves with the neha when the sound of hooves echoed from the mountain's base. At first, 1, then 2, then 3, and soon the entire camp seemed to hold its breath. Children were pulled into lodges. Women withdrew their hands from boiling pots. Ayanna stepped from the main lodge with her forest staff in her left hand. Clara sensed a shift in the air, not cold, not tense, just a quiet, deep change. Another presence was entering this land. Talon rode out first, signaling for the approaching riders to stop. They were men from the nearest town, likely local officials or suppliers of medicine and food. They wore thick coats, carried sidearms, and bore leather satchels on their hips. But the man who turned Clara to stone was the fourth. He wasn't on horseback, but seated in a cart. Silver beard, sunken eyes, thin but imposing. Dr. Elton, the man who had delivered her children. The last person to see Elijah alive before he fell from his horse and never came back. Clara gripped the fabric in her hands. They trembled, not from cold, but because everything she had left behind, once buried in snow, now stood fully formed in front of her. One of the riders spoke. "We received word of a white woman, Clara Granger, missing since last winter. Her husband perished, but there were no signs of foul play. The town needs to confirm—" His voice was cut off as Talon stepped forward. "No one is missing here. She's living." The man smiled thinly. "Maybe so, but the law doesn't call it living if she hasn't returned to sign the inheritance papers." Clara flinched. "Inheritance?" The man nodded. "Elijah Granger, your husband. Turns out he inherited a mining parcel no one in his family knew about. That land's now worth over $30,000, and it belongs to you." The camp fell silent. Talon looked at Clara. Ayanna's grip on her staff tightened, but Clara's eyes stayed locked on Dr. Alton. The old man finally spoke, not coldly, not with scorn, just asked, "Do you remember the way you left town, Clara? Without a word? With nothing but 2 newborns and a leather journal?" Clara stepped forward. Her feet barely touched the ground. Her voice was hoarse but clear. "I didn't leave to disappear. I left because no one believed I could stay. When I lost Elijah, I lost my place in a world that only sees women through their husband's last name." After a pause, she added, "I don't need land. I need space for my children to breathe, without being labeled the burden of a dead man." Her eyes burned now. "And if you're here to take me back with law, know this. Here, I've been called by my true name. No surname needed." The man holding the document sighed, ready to speak again, but Dr. Alton lifted a hand. He looked at Clara, long and deep, then nodded slowly. "Then you are alive," he said, "and alive enough not to need proving any more." He turned away, addressing the others. "No pressure. Whoever needs papers, leave them. The rest, pull out." Within minutes, hoofbeats faded into the hills. Talon walked toward Clara. He didn't ask if she was okay. He just stood beside her, like a tree tall enough to shelter without demanding anyone look up. Clara exhaled, not from exhaustion, but like shedding old skin. The past had come for her, but this time she didn't collapse. She wasn't dragged away. She stood firm, within the fire, within her new name, within invisible arms she once thought she'd never belong to. Deep down, Clara knew that to survive, you need instinct. But to live truthfully, you need the courage to face yourself, both the parts you wish to forget and the parts that are just beginning to bloom. Clara never spoke of the visitors from town again. No one in the camp brought it up. No questions asked. Here, people didn't live through the past. They lived through each slice of the present, carved by wind, by flame, by silent endurance. But Clara remembered. On long nights, holding Lily and Elias to sleep, she recalled every word, every look, every mention of inheritance. She didn't deny that something had been lost, but she also wouldn't let it take what she'd now built. One morning, before the sun climbed the mountain's ridge, Clara walked to the back of the lodge, where the ground had been bare and stony. She began to dig, small cuts in the earth. Her hands, calloused from pounding herbs and stripping leaves, now held a hoe like a needle. No one told her to. No one ordered her. But no one stopped her either. Neha arrived first. She didn't ask why, she simply brought a pail of water. Then Zena, carrying dried leaves that repelled insects. Ayana stood further off, gripping her staff, her gaze never leaving Clara as she planted seed after seed. Each plant was arranged by purpose. Fever leaf in the front row, wound root to the right, stomach-soothing blooms in the sunniest center. Clara drew from elders, from hazy memories of her mother, from things Elijah had said on sleepless nights. But more than anything, she learned by putting her heart into the dirt. 1 month later, the first sprout broke through, thin as a hair, but alive. Elias tottered between the rows, gripping soft stems to steady himself. Lily sat beside a pile of dry grass, playing with fallen petals. One afternoon, a fierce wind came through, as if to test what had taken root. Clara feared the garden would be gone. But the next morning, the first thing she saw was that the plants still stood. Not tall, not wide, but upright. So was she. On the 40th day since sowing, Ayana arrived with a small embroidered cloth. She placed it in Clara's hands. On it, a leaf and 2 parallel flames. "You've changed this place," she said. "Not with words, but with work." Clara held the cloth tight. Talon came closer. He was no longer the distant man she had once met. Kneeling beside the rose, he said softly, "The children will grow up thinking this is normal. But you and I know, this normal was once impossible." Clara nodded. "And that's why we have to protect it." From then on, Clara's days began with watering the garden, teaching Elias to name each plant in both English and Comanche, telling Lily stories about the father she'd never meet, and writing lines into a small book. Not for anyone else, but for herself in the years to come. "Today, we no longer run from the past," she wrote. "We use it to make soil." By the time spring poured into every crevice and canopy, Clara's garden had become a place where the wounded came. Not to be healed, but to be heard. She wasn't a healer, she was someone who had hurt, and knew how to touch pain without making it sting worse. And strangely, like earth and like a seed, what you touch with both hands and heart tends to take root. The rain came without warning. No churning black clouds, no distant thunder, just a shift in the wind and a sudden heaviness in the air. When the first drop struck the lodge's roof, Clara was finishing another cloth, stitching the names of her children as she did every night after dinner. But by the 5th drop, the 10th, and then a wall of water fell across the world as a breath turned into a flood. She knew this was not ordinary rain. Within an hour, the camp became a basin of mud. Water channels turned into streams, then into rushing rivers, carrying branches and yesterday's ash. Talon and the men ran to secure the tents, which swayed dangerously. Ayanna stood in the extinguished fire ring, shouting in the language of her ancestors, not just to the spirits but to the hearts of the people. Listen to the earth, listen to the water, and move. Clara didn't ask. There was no time to ask. She strapped the children to her, wrapped in the waterproof hide Zena had tossed her. Then she ran to the garden. Her rose, her spring's life, were sinking fast into sludge. No one called her back, no one forbade her, but no one expected she would go. Clara crouched, slicing small roots with a knife, scooping whole seed pods into the small cloth bag she had prepared on the day she first planted. She couldn't save the garden, but she could save its beginning. The wind howled. The water from the mountain rose faster than anyone imagined. What had once been a quiet brook now roared like a river, slamming into the rocks and tearing away the camp's outer edges. For the first time in nearly 3 months, Clara felt real fear. Not for herself, but because this time she carried 2 lives, a handful of seeds, and the memory of everything she had grown. As the camp moved to higher ground, Talon shouted, "North path! Follow the trees! Anyone who falls behind is lost." Clara followed, not in the back. She was third. Her legs waded through knee-deep mud, hands gripping the seed pouch, her back protecting her children, her chest carrying a promise. Nothing else will be lost. Neha slipped. Clara pulled her up. Another child cried, lost in the noise. Clara crouched to shield them with her own cloak. When they reached the forest's edge, where the wind still roared, but the water had not yet reached, everyone stopped. Soaked bodies, missing tents, firewood swept away, but not a single cry of defeat. The Comanche do not weep during floods. They raised temporary poles with salvaged trunks. Ayanna walked to each one, checking who was hurt and who still had strength. And when she came to Clara, she said nothing. He only looked at her water-soaked hair, the clarity still alive in her eyes, the hands clutching the seed pouch, and then nodded. Talon arrived next. "What did you save?" he asked. Clara opened the pouch and showed him. He looked at the handfuls of tender roots, the mud-stained seeds, and stood silent for a long time. Finally, he said softly, "So you chose to keep the future." Clara responded with a tired but certain nod. "If we don't keep it, the water will take everything, but if we keep it, we can plant again." That night, they managed to build a fire. Not large, not warm enough for the whole camp, but enough to dry hands, bits of wood, and scraps of hope. And as the firelight flickered across the faces of those who had stayed, Clara realized that not every land holds your footprints, but any place that holds your people, that is home. The rain withdrew on the 3rd day. The ground remained soaked, but the wind had stopped howling and the floods no longer pounded the rocks. The temporary camp built high above was still rough, but people had resumed their rhythms, walking, building, cooking, healing, living. And within those quiet movements, Clara understood something. No one brought up the past. Not because they forgot, but because they were too busy continuing. So was she. Her garden was gone. But in that small cloth pouch the seeds remained. And every morning, before the sun rose, she would open it, looking at each one, as if whispering a promise that tomorrow could still be planted. One evening, while stoking the fire, Neha whispered to Clara, "Someone like you deserves to be named before the fire." Clara thought the girl was joking, but that night, under a high moon, Ayana stepped into the lodge where Clara was putting Lily to sleep. "Tomorrow morning," she said, "the council will light the sacred flame. If you agree, wear red cloth and bring with you what you wish to keep." Clara froze. Since arriving here, she had witnessed the fire circle ritual 3 times. Once, for a boy becoming a man. The second is for an elder nearing the end, and the third, for a warrior who returned with only one eye from a borderland raid. But never, never for an outsider. The next morning, Clara wore the red garment Zena had brought her, silent, wordless, but embroidered by hand with care. She carried Elias, held Lily's hand, and followed Ayana to the sacred ground. The circle was full. All eyes turned to the fire pit, still unlit, where only those whose names were called were allowed to step. Clara bowed, laid her seed pouch at the center, and placed her children beside it. Ayana approached. No blessing, no speech. She only asked, "What is your true name? Not your husband's, not your father's, not what others once gave you, but the one you believe you are." Clara lifted her head. She exhaled and said, "My name is Clara." Ayana nodded. From her pouch, she pulled a branch of sacred flame and lit the wood that had been prepared. The fire rose, not wildly, but bright enough to cast light on all who watched. Then she took ashes from the flame and drew a symbol on Clara's forehead, a spiral counterclockwise. Talon stepped forward and placed his hand on Clara's shoulder, not as a rescuer, but as someone who stood beside her. Then each person in the circle bowed to her. No applause, no cheers. But in the silence, Clara heard the call. She was no longer a guest, no longer the widow from the West. She was Clara, seed-bearer, protector, survivor, not to tell the story but to lead it. That night, as Clara cradled her children beneath the moonlight seeping through the tent's seams, the ash mark still lingered on her forehead. She didn't wipe it away. She left it, like a reminder that some flames don't burn. They illuminate the parts of ourselves we once forgot were there. Many years passed since that night by the fire. The old camp had since become a large communal site, with 3 living circles, an herbal medicine lodge, and a garden bed known by the elders as Clara's Hands. But Clara never named anything after herself. She simply lived, like water, like the morning light, not for glory, but because she was needed. Elias was now a tall young man, trained in remedies by Ayana herself before she grew too old and passed him the symbolic herb pouch. Lily loved to write. The girl with Elijah's smile often sat for hours by the creek, recording the wind, the woods, and the lessons no school could teach. One early spring day, when wild peach blossoms painted the hills purple, Clara called her children to the small fire pit behind the camp, where now it was just her and the 2 people she loved most in the world. "Is there anything you haven't told us?" Lily asked. Clara said nothing at first, then slowly opened an old cloth pouch, the same one that once held her seeds. Inside, there were no seeds now, only a faded piece of paper, on which shaky handwriting read, "We don't need land to call it home. We need memories to know we've lived." Elias went quiet. Lily held the note and read it again. "Did you write this?" she asked. Clara smiled. "I did. on the night I thought there'd be no tomorrow." She looked up at the sky, its light beaming through the leaves. And yet, morning still came. "Do you regret it?" Elias asked. "Not going back to town? Not claiming the land Dad left?" Clara shook her head. "I didn't need land. I needed a place where my children could take root without being pulled out." "And we," Lily whispered, "we were those seeds." Clara squeezed her daughter's hand and nodded. "And now you are trees. And now I can step back, like the soil after the sowing." As the afternoon faded, the three of them stayed by the fire, no more words needed. The golden hour lit Lily's black hair and brushed Elias's straight nose. Both of them now carried a part of Elijah, a part of Clara, and the rest belonged to the land that raised them. In Clara's heart there was no emptiness, only gratitude. Gratitude for winters past, for the hands that caught her when she nearly fell, for the seedlings that once trembled but still reached for light. And most of all, gratitude for herself, for not letting go, even when no one promised to catch her. This story doesn't end in triumph. It flows like a stream, gentle, strong enough to shape stone, soft enough to lull the fields to sleep. And when night fell, the fire beside the mother and her children still burned, not for warmth, but to remind us. Some memories must be passed down, not because they hurt, but because they prove that love once lived here, in the form of a woman who carried 2 children through a blizzard and found spring. And so, in a land that once was only shelter after a storm, a mother made it home. Not just for her 2 little ones, but for an entire community that once saw her as a stranger. Clara did not fight with force, but with endurance. She didn't conquer anyone, but somehow even the deepest wounds in others began to learn how to heal. If you've made it this far, maybe this story has touched a place in your heart too, a place where you fought silently to protect what you love, where you've kept walking even when no one noticed. And if so, please share this story, so someone still caught in the storm might learn sometimes saving just one seed is enough to grow an entire life again. Where are you watching from today? Let us know, so this story can know how far it has traveled and how many hearts it has touched. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel because this is not the last story. Many more vivid, emotional, and hopeful journeys are waiting for you. Thank you for listening, with all your understanding and tenderness. See you on the next journey, where hearts continue to be told through the softest and deepest of whispers.